Giuliano Ferrante had survived ambushes on the Naples coastal road, a poisoning attempt disguised as a peace offering, and two separate betrayals by men he had once called brothers, without ever once losing his composure. Yet, on an ordinary evening, standing in the doorway of a nursery light, Giuliano Ferrante discovered something far more dangerous than any of it. His son slept peacefully against a woman's chest, one small fist curled into her nightgown, and Giuliano felt his own hands clench at his sides with an emotion he could not, for the first time in his adult life, name or control. He was jealous, jealous of an infant, jealous of his own child for receiving so effortlessly the very thing he didn't know he had been starving for. Before we go any further into how a man like that arrived at a moment like this, stay with us, because this is exactly the kind of story worth losing an evening to. The forbidden Mafia romances, the powerful men who never expected to feel anything at all, the healing that comes from the last person either of them saw coming. If that's the kind of story you love, settle in, subscribe, and tune up the volume, because what happens between Giuliano Ferrante and Amelia Bianchi is going to change everything both of them believed about love, about family, and about the walls they built to survive. This is the story of a man who believed emotion was a weakness no powerful man could afford, and a woman who walked into his world with nothing left to lose but her own quiet strength. A story about a house that forgot how to breathe, a child who refused to live, and the one person who managed to save them both without ever meaning to save herself in the process. Months earlier, before Giuliano Ferrante ever stood in that nursery doorway consumed by something as foreign as jealousy, before he understood what Amelia Bianchi would come to mean to him, the Ferrante mansion had become a house that had forgotten how to breathe. It sat on the hills above the coast, all pale stone and iron gates, the kind of house built to keep the world out. For 37 years it had succeeded. Giuliano Ferrante was one of the most feared men in Italy, a man whose name alone closed deals and ended arguments, a man who had built an empire on the simple, brutal understanding that emotion was a door left open for enemies to walk through. He had married once for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with alliance, and he had respected his wife exactly as much as she had respected him, which is to say, deeply, and without either of them ever pretending it was more than what it was. She had known he didn't love her the way poets described love. She had accepted it with the same clear-eyed pragmatism with which she had accepted everything else about the life she'd married into. She had died bringing their son into the world. Giuliano had not loved her the way husbands were supposed to love their wives, and the guilt of that, of a woman giving her life for a marriage built on convenience rather than devotion, had settled into his chest like a stone that never moved, never softened, never let him forget. His son, Leonardo, had become the only pure thing left in a life built almost entirely of transaction and consequence. And now, weeks after his wife's death, Leonardo was dying too, in the quietest, most helpless way imaginable. The baby refused every bottle, every formula, every desperate attempt by the household's most capable women to coax nourishment into his small, weakening body. He cried until he had no strength left to cry, and then he simply lay still, and the silence that followed was worse than any scream Giuliano had ever heard in his life. "He's growing weaker," Dr. Marco Bellini told him one evening, his voice carefully neutral in the way doctors trained themselves to be when delivering news that could break a man. "Mr. Ferrante, if he doesn't take nourishment soon, I don't know how much longer his body can hold on."
Giuliano had faced armed men without flinching. He had ordered violence with the same detachment other men used to order coffee. And in that moment, standing over his son's crib, listening to a doctor tell him that nothing he owned, nothing he controlled, nothing he had built could save the one person who mattered more than all of it combined, Giuliano Ferrante felt, for the first time in decades, entirely powerless. Across the city, in a small rented room above a shuttered bakery, Amelia Bianchi was learning what powerlessness felt like too, in a different and quieter way. She was 28, soft in every place the world told women not to be soft, with warm brown eyes that had once held nothing but hope and now held something heavier. She had spent 4 years loving Paolo Rinaldi, 4 years building a future with him one careful euro at a time, saving toward a small restaurant they'd planned to open together once they married. She had trusted him with everything, her money, her body, eventually her pregnancy. And Paolo had repaid that trust by emptying their shared savings account, denying the child was his, and disappearing before she'd even finished telling him she loved him. The stress of it, the betrayal, the grief, the terror of facing motherhood entirely alone had done something to her body that no doctor could fully explain, only confirm. Her son had been stillborn. She had held him for 11 minutes in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and impossible grief, and then they had taken him away, and Amelia had gone home to an empty apartment with nothing left. No savings, no fiancé, no child, only a body that cruelly still remembered how to nurture a baby that no longer existed. She hadn't known such work existed until her cousin mentioned it in passing, a wealthy family in the hills, desperate for a wet nurse for a newborn who wouldn't feed. Amelia had sat with the idea for 2 full days, turning it over with a mixture of grief and something that felt almost like relief. If she could not keep her own child alive, perhaps she could keep someone else's. She arrived at the Ferrante estate on a gray Tuesday morning, exhausted, grieving, and entirely unprepared for the reception she received. 3 other women had already tried and failed to feed Leonardo that week. The household staff, a stern, kind-eyed housekeeper named Teresa, and a warm, older nanny named Caterina, watched with weary hope as Amelia was shown into the nursery, where Giuliano Ferrante stood in the corner like a shadow that refused to leave, his jaw tight, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He didn't introduce himself, he simply watched, arms crossed, radiating the kind of controlled tension that made the room feel smaller. Amelia lifted the crying infant into her arms without hesitation, murmuring something low and soft in Italian, a lullaby half remembered from her own childhood. And then, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, something happened that made Teresa's hand fly to her mouth and made Giuliano's entire body go still. Leonardo stopped crying. He turned his small face toward her, rooting instinctively, and latched, and began to feed, desperately, hungrily, the way a starving thing finally found what it needed all along. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the first peaceful silence that house had heard in weeks, and Giuliano stood frozen in the doorway listening to it, feeling something crack open in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet.
"You're hired," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Whatever you need, whatever it costs, you stay." Amelia looked up at him over the baby's head, this stranger, this feared man the whole coast whispered in about in careful tones, and saw only a father whose hands were shaking with relief. "I'll stay," she said simply, "as long as he needs me." Neither of them understood in that moment how long that would turn out to be. The first weeks passed in a rhythm neither of them expected to find comforting. Amelia moved into a room near the nursery, and slowly the house began to breathe again. Leonardo gained weight. He slept in longer stretches. He began, astonishingly, to smile, small, gummy, involuntary smiles that appeared only when Amelia was near, as though some part of him had already decided who in this house was safe. Giuliano told himself he was simply grateful. Gratitude was a clean, uncomplicated emotion, one he understood the shape of. It was easy to attribute the warmth spreading through his chest when he watched Amelia with his son to something as simple as relief. It became harder to believe that on her first evening properly settled into the house, when Giuliano rounded a hallway corner and nearly collided with her coming the other way. She smelled of something he couldn't immediately place, a soft floral note, nothing artificial or heavy, the kind of natural scent that seemed to belong entirely to her skin rather than a bottle. Beneath it, faint and warm, the milk-sweet scent that clung to her after she'd just finished feeding Leonardo, a scent Giuliano had never consciously registered on any other woman in his life. The combination hit him low in his chest, sudden and unwelcome, an instinctive, primitive awareness that had nothing to do with decision or logic. He stepped back too quickly, said something clipped about watching where she walked, and retreated to his study with his heart beating harder than it had any right to, furious at himself without entirely understanding why. He told himself it was exhaustion, grief, the strange chemical disorder of a house recovering from near tragedy. He was not a man who noticed women, had never chased them, had never allowed himself the indulgence of wanting anyone the way ordinary men wanted. He buried the moment like he buried everything inconvenient, and told himself, with the particular confidence of a man used to being obeyed by his own mind, that it would not happen again. It happened again the very next day, and the day after that. Every time she passed him in a hallway, every time she leaned over Leonardo's crib close enough that Giuliano caught that same warm, floral, milk-soft scent, something in him tightened that he refused to examine. He began finding reasons to walk past the nursery. He told himself he was checking on his son. He was not entirely lying. Leonardo's health mattered to him more than his own life, but it was not lost on him in the small, honest hours before sleep that he lingered longer than necessary in doorways where Amelia was present, that his eyes tracked her rather than the crib, that some deeply buried instinct he'd spent his whole life suppressing had woken up and refused to go back to sleep. It was worse when he watched her with Leonardo directly. His son had begun to reach for her the instant she entered a room, had begun sleeping soundly only in her arms, had begun offering her the kind of open, uncomplicated smiles Giuliano himself hadn't earned from anyone in longer than he cared to admit. He stood in doorways watching the two of them together, Amelia humming softly, Leonardo's small hand curled against her collarbone, and felt something twist in his chest that took him embarrassingly long to identify. He was jealous of his own son, not of the attention Leonardo received, of the ease of it, of the way Amelia's face softened without effort, without performance, entirely unguarded, in a way Giuliano hadn't seen directed at him by anyone in longer than he cared to admit. He wanted that warmth. He wanted the smile. He wanted, God help him, to be looked at the way his infant son was looked at, and the sheer humiliation of that want made him retreat from the nursery entirely for 2 full days, burying himself in ledgers and territory disputes that suddenly felt like a mercy.
The accident happened on the 3rd evening when Giuliano returned home earlier than expected from a meeting that had ended in less bloodshed than anticipated. He climbed the stairs toward the nursery, intending only to check on Leonardo before retreating to his study, and pushed the door open just as Amelia stepped through from the adjoining bathroom, freshly bathed,
wrapped in nothing but a towel secured hastily at her chest, her dark hair damp against her shoulders. She startled at the sight of him, one hand flying to the towel, her bare foot catching against the edge of the rug. She lost her balance entirely, and Giuliano's body moved before his mind caught up, closing the distance and catching her instinctively. Except her weight and momentum carried them both down together, and he hit the floor with her full length sprawled across him, her generous curves pressed flush against his chest, her damp hair falling across his jaw, the warm floral milk scent of her suddenly, overwhelmingly close. Neither of them moved for several long seconds. Giuliano became aware, in rapid, humiliating succession, of two undeniable facts. His heart was slamming against his ribs harder than it had in any gunfight he could remember, and his body had responded to the sudden, full-length press of her against him in a way that left absolutely no room for denial. He saw the exact moment Emilia noticed it too, her breath catching, her eyes going wide, a flush spreading rapidly up her throat and into her cheeks. She scrambled off him with a small, mortified sound, clutching the towel tighter, murmuring something about being sorry about not hearing him come in, and fled into the nursery's adjoining room before he could form a single coherent word. Giuliano lay on the floor for a long moment after she'd gone, staring at the ceiling, his pulse refusing to settle, and understood with a kind of grim, terrifying clarity that whatever this was, denial was no longer an option available to him. He had wanted a woman, this woman specifically, entirely, undeniably, with a physical urgency he had never once experienced in his adult life, and no amount of discipline or willpower was going to argue that fact out of existence. Neither of them spoke of it the next day, or the day after, but something had shifted between them that neither could pretend away, a new awareness in every glance, a careful distance neither of them quite managed to maintain. It was nearly 2 weeks later that they found themselves both awake at 2 in the morning, drawn by separate insomnias into the same quiet kitchen. Emilia was making tea when Giuliano appeared in the doorway, and instead of retreating the way she half expected him to, he crossed the room and sat across from her at the worn wooden table, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they simply talked. She told him about her son. About 11 minutes that had felt like both an eternity and no time at all. About a nursery she'd painted yellow that no one would ever sleep in. About the particular loneliness of grieving a person the world insisted she barely knew. Giuliano listened without offering the empty comfort other people reached for, without flinching from the weight of it. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I never loved my wife," he said, the words coming slower than he intended, as though each one cost him something. "Not the way she deserved. She knew it. She married me anyway because it was practical, because our families needed the alliance, and she accepted a life without romance because she believed it was enough. And she died giving me a son I don't know how to raise without her." His jaw tightened. "I carry that every day. Guilt for a debt I can never repay her." Emilia reached across the table without entirely deciding to, her hand settling over his, and Giuliano did not pull away. "Grief doesn't require the same kind of love to be real," she said quietly. "You're allowed to mourn what she gave you, even if you couldn't give her everything back." Something in his chest loosened hearing that, in a way nothing had in months. The jealousy did not disappear after that night. If anything, it deepened, twisting itself into something more complicated than simple want. One exhausting evening, when Leonardo refused to settle unless Emilia stayed beside his crib, she eventually gave in to her own exhaustion and fell asleep in the small daybed beside him, the baby eventually migrating, in the wandering way infants do, into the curve of her arms. Giuliano found them there well past midnight, intending only to check on his son before retiring, and found himself unable to leave. He lowered himself on the far side of the bed, telling himself it was only to remain close to Leonardo, and watched the two of them sleep in the pale wash of moonlight through the nursery window. His son's small face pressed trustingly against her chest, her arm curved protectively around him even in sleep, entirely instinctive, entirely unconscious. Giuliano lay there for a long time simply watching, and the ache that built in his chest had nothing gentle about it. It was raw, possessive, uncomfortably primitive, the same feeling that had gripped him the day he'd first caught her scent in the hallway, except sharper now, less deniable. He wanted to be the one she reached for like that, wanted with a hunger that frightened him to be the one whose chest her cheek rested against without thought or hesitation. He carried Leonardo gently back to his crib before either of them woke, unable to trust himself to remain in that bed a moment longer, and the jealousy followed him through the entirety of the following day, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. It was a smaller moment days later that undid Amelia entirely, one Giuliano never intended for her to witness. Amelia had expressed milk earlier that evening, storing it carefully as Dr. Bellini had instructed, before finally allowing herself the exhausted sleep she'd been putting off for days. Leonardo awoke crying near 2 in the morning, and rather than wake her, Giuliano rose himself, moved quietly to the nursery and warmed the bottle with the careful, deliberate patience of a man determined not to fail his son. Amelia awoke anyway, some instinct pulling her from sleep, and found herself drawn toward the nursery door left slightly ajar. She stopped there, silent, unnoticed, and watched. Giuliano sat in the rocking chair with his son cradled against his chest, feeding him with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man the entire coast whispered about in frightened tones. He burped him carefully afterward, rocked him with slow, steady patience until his small eyes finally closed, and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead. And then, believing himself entirely alone, he whispered something so quiet Amelia had to hold her breath to catch. "It's you and me, Piccolo," he murmured against his son's hair. "Whatever happens in this world, I will protect you with everything I am. I promise you that." Amelia stood in the darkened hallway that night with her hand pressed against her mouth, tears rising unbidden, watching the feared Giuliano Ferrante disappear entirely, replaced by nothing but a father devoted so completely to his son that it rearranged something in her chest she hadn't been prepared for. She had come to this house seeing only a frightening, powerful man. In that unguarded moment, she saw instead the person beneath all of it, gentle, disciplined, quietly breaking under the weight of a love he didn't know how to speak of anywhere but in whispers meant for no one but a sleeping child. She returned to her room that night carrying something new and unwelcome and entirely undeniable. Admiration had become something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to love. The peace the household had found could not, of course, last uninterrupted. Paolo Rinaldi found her 3 weeks later. He appeared first as a message delivered through a cousin who still spoke to her, an apology dressed as manipulation, a claim that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to make things right, that he needed to see her. Amelia refused to respond. He escalated within days, appearing outside the estate's gates, then attempting to bribe a member of staff for information about her routine, growing bolder and more desperate with each rejection, driven by something that had far less to do with love than with the money he'd already spent and needed replacing. Giuliano's men reported the harassment before Amelia ever worked up the courage to mention it herself, and something cold and lethal settled behind his eyes the moment he understood what was happening. This was no longer a matter of protecting his son's caretaker. Somewhere in the past weeks, without his permission, Emilia Bianchi had become inseparable from his own life, and the thought of Paolo Rinaldi anywhere near her ignited a fury Giuliano hadn't felt in years. "He won't touch you," he told her, his voice low and absolute. "I promise you that." Paolo, it turned out, was more desperate and less rational than either of them anticipated. Cornered by debts he'd created spending Emilia's stolen savings, convinced that reclaiming her or extracting money from the powerful man now sheltering her was his only remaining option, he made the final catastrophic mistake of arranging her kidnapping from outside a small pharmacy in town where she'd gone for supplies for Leonardo. The call came to Giuliano within the hour. He had faced war, betrayal, and violence with unshaking calm his entire adult life. Nothing had ever terrified him the way the sound of Emilia's name attached to the word "taken" did. He led the rescue himself, refusing every attempt by his men to keep him at a safe distance. They found the warehouse before midnight, a rotting building near the old shipping docks lit by a single bare bulb. Emilia bound to a chair with her chin lifted in defiance, even as fear lived plainly in her eyes. Paolo stood over her, pacing, rehearsing threats he didn't have the nerve to carry out. He never got the chance. Giuliano crossed the room before his own men had cleared the doorway, and Paolo barely had time to turn before a fist caught him across the jaw with enough force to send him crashing into a stack of crates. He came up swinging, wild and desperate, landing one glancing blow against Giuliano's shoulder before Giuliano drove him back down with a second strike that split his lip open and a third that folded him over entirely, gasping. Giuliano hauled him up by the collar, close enough that Paolo could see exactly how little mercy remained behind his eyes. "You touched what's mine," Giuliano said, low and even, more frightening for how quiet it was. "You don't get to walk away from that unmarked." He drove one final blow into Paolo's ribs, hard enough to drop him to the concrete gasping, and then straightened his jacket with the same cold discipline he brought to every act of violence in his life, as if the fury had already been folded away neatly. "Take him," he told the two men flanking the door. "Deliver him to the police with everything they need to put him away for the kidnapping. Make sure he understands, if he so much as breathes in her direction again or comes near my son, the police will be the least of what finds him." He didn't wait to watch them drag Paolo out. He was already crossing the room to Emilia, cutting the rope at her wrists himself, his hands unsteady in a way she had never once seen from him. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, checking her wrists, her face, searching her for injury with a kind of barely leashed desperation. "Emilia, look at me. Are you hurt anywhere?" "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice shook. "I'm okay, Giuliano." He pulled her against his chest without another word, one hand cradling the back of her head, and held her there for a long moment, as though he needed the proof of her heartbeat against his own to fully believe it. He took her home himself, his arm around her the entire drive, refusing to let go even to shift the car into gear more than necessary. At the house, Teresa met them at the door with warm towels and quiet efficiency, and Giuliano waited outside Emilia's room while she washed away the night, the rope marks, the dust of the warehouse floor, the fear that clung to her skin, changing into a soft robe before he knocked, quiet and careful, and let himself in when she called for him. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, hair still damp, her hands folded in her lap. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Does anything hurt?" he asked quietly. "Your wrists, your head, anywhere at all, tell me." "Just my wrists a little," she admitted,
and he lifted one gently to his mouth, pressing the softest kiss against the faint red marks there, his eyes never leaving hers. I have faced war, betrayal, and violence with unshaking calm my entire adult life. Nothing has ever terrified me the way tonight did. The thought of losing you. He stopped, jaw tightening, and pressed his forehead briefly against her hands. I told myself for weeks this was gratitude, convenience. I told myself 100 careful lies to avoid admitting what this actually is. I am done lying to both of us, Amelia. He lifted his head, and what she saw in his face stole the breath from her lungs. Every wall he had spent a lifetime building gone. I want you, he said, not as Leonardo's wet nurse, not as gratitude for saving my son's life. I want you the way I have never wanted anything in this world, and it terrifies me more than every enemy I've ever faced. Amelia's eyes filled, months of carefully buried feeling finally breaking loose at once. I fell in love with the man hidden underneath everyone else's fear of you, she whispered, cupping his face in her hands. I fell in love with the father who whispers promises to his son in the middle of the night, believing no one can hear him. I have loved that man for weeks, Giuliano. I was only ever afraid you'd never let anyone else see him. I see him with you, he said roughly. Only with you. You didn't just save my son's life, Amelia. You reached into a house that had forgotten to feel anything at all, and you gave it back to me. You gave me back to me. He rose enough to sit beside her, framing her face in both hands, his thumbs tracing slow along her cheekbones, as though memorizing her. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice low and unsteady. And I will. But I don't want to spend one more night pretending I don't feel this. Don't stop, she breathed. Please don't stop. He kissed her then, finally, without a single trace of the restraint he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. It was slow at first, almost reverent, his hand sliding into her damp hair, and then it deepened all at once, months of denial breaking apart between them. She felt the low sound he made against her mouth, felt his other hand splay wide against her back, mapping the soft, generous curves he had spent weeks trying to not notice, pulling her flush against him, as though the distance between them had cost him something physical. Her fingers curled into his front shirt, and when she gasped against his lips, he groaned low in his throat and gathered her closer still, kissing her like a man finally allowed to stop denying himself the one thing he'd wanted most. I have wanted you since the day I caught your scent in that hallway, he murmured against her jaw, his mouth trailing lower, unhurried and worshipful. I have lain awake more nights than I will admit, aching for exactly this. I thought it was only me, she whispered, breathless, her hands sliding up into his hair. I thought I was the only one drowning. You were never alone in it, he said against her throat, not for a single night. He eased her back against the pillows, his weight settling over her with careful reverence, every touch unhurried, despite the hunger written plainly across his face, as though he intended to spend the rest of the night proving, in every way he knew how, exactly how long he had wanted her, and exactly how done he was pretending otherwise. What followed, neither of them would ever fully put into words. There was nothing left to say that their bodies weren't already saying more honestly than language ever could. The months that followed rebuilt the Ferrante house into something it had never been in all the years Giuliano had lived in it. Leonardo grew strong and curious, taking his first unsteady steps across the same nursery floor where Amelia had once saved his life with nothing but her presence and her patience. Teresa and Katharina, watching the household transform from a place of cold silence into a home filled with laughter and warmth, exchanged knowing glances whenever Giuliano lingered in doorways to watch Amelia with his son, no longer bothering to hide the way his expression softened completely in her presence. Late one evening, Giuliano stood in the same nursery doorway where jealousy had first taught him what he was capable of feeling, watching Amelia hold his son against her chest as the last gold light of evening fell across them both. He understood, watching them, that she had done far more than save Leonardo's life months ago. She had reached into a house that had forgotten to feel anything at all and given it back its warmth, its hope, its capacity for love. And she had done it without ever meaning to save the one man in that house who believed with absolute certainty that he was already beyond saving. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around them both, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Giuliano Ferrante felt something he had spent his entire life avoiding. He felt, completely and without fear, at peace. If you enjoy stories just like this, do not forget to subscribe and turn on your notification button. Thanks for listening.